Hello and welcome to Connected. I'm Divya Gopalan. Historically and today, the voices of Indigenous people are filtered and even distorted by mainstream society, narratives given by governments and academics, and the media with little representation. And not surprisingly, it's resulted in misunderstandings, stereotyping, prejudices, and even institutionalized discrimination. And that is what both our guests' ancestors once endured, and for many, it's still very much a reality. But today, we want to hear their voices clearly and understand their journey of identity and their hopes for the future of their communities. For that, joining us, we have Nadira Ilana in Kuala Lumpur, a Malaysian filmmaker, and we have Fran Pan in Taipei, a public worker. Thank you both for being part of this program. I want to start, as I said, with your own journeys to begin with. But before I go to that, Nadira, tell us more about your people.
Okay. Thanks for having me on the show. Firstly, Divya. My background is I'm mixed ethnic Dusun as well. So Dusun Pijau, Tindal, and Ghana from Sabah. And the Kadazan Dusuns are the indigenous majority of North Borneo.
And Fran, this may seem like an odd question to you, but what's your name?
Actually, when I met the people from the English native speaker, I use Fran. But actually, I do have an indigenous name, which I don't commonly use. That it could be a topic we discuss later, as a Yadan Gawats. The Yadan is the given name, and Gawats is the family house name. Yeah, because we don't have a last name in my group, so we call it family house name.
And Nadira, just as pointed to you, I want to start with your own experience here. You mentioned not knowing you were Indigenous until your 20s. Can you explain?
It's not that my parents didn't talk to me about my heritage, but I do come from a mixed background as well. And I attended a Chinese school. So I actually spoke Chinese to my Dusun grandmother growing up. And so I think for that generation who were around during the formation of Malaysia, I think they sort of to assimilate to the country, they pushed it down. But also whatever representations of indigenous peoples, because I grew up in the city as well, we were always painted as jungle people. And that wasn't necessarily my experience of it. And it wasn't until much later that I became aware more of the narratives and the politics and my own personal connection to it, that I started to identify as an indigenous person.
And Fran, for you, it's slightly reverse. You grew up in your ancestral village. Can you tell us what that was like?
Yeah, I have to say, fortunately, I'm very lucky. Even 30 years ago, the Taiwanese society, people are not very, respect the indigenous culture. But that time, my father, who comes from the Mingnan, or people say Han, the ethnic from Taiwan, but my father is very respect my mom's culture. So actually, most of the time, I live in where my mom work, and most of the time, my mom work in the indigenous community. So I grew up in my mother's side. So I don't have this journey that to find myself indigenous identification, because I grew up in this mixed culture or cross cultures surrounding. Yeah, so I have to say I'm very lucky.
Nadira, speaking about the wider population of Malaysia, often when you, even at a governmental level, it's divided into Bumi, Malays, Indian, and Chinese. Where do indigenous people fall into that?
Indigenous peoples would fall under Bumiputra still. From my studies, because I had also done a documentary called The Silent Riot in 2012, which was about the Sabah political riots of 1985 following an election there. And so that's kind of how I learned more about Sabah's political history and how Borneo politics had sort of systematically been dominated by federal, even starting since the formation of Malaysia, really. I don't know why I'm laughing. I think just because I guess it's just so absurd. But yeah, I believe that Borneo politics has often been controlled by federal, but there are efforts since 2010 to reverse that.
Right. And Fran, I remember speaking to you earlier, and you talk about your move from the ancestral village to the city, which was somewhat of a culture shock, which kind of speaks to a wider issue of how Indigenous people are perceived in Taiwan, particularly in the cities. Can you speak to that?
I think the urban Indigenous issue is not only in Taiwan and is happening all around the world, because I think now in Taiwan it's like 50-50. 50 people still live in their homeland and 50 already migrate to the city. And myself, because I moved to the, when I was a kid, I thought myself as Indigenous like naturally. But when I moved to the study, because the good university, most of the time they are in the city. So I just realized, well, there's a differences actually between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people.
And speaking to that, Nadira, do you see a clear kind of difference in perception in rural areas or areas, like in Borneo, and then you come to the big city like Kuala Lumpur? What is the difference in perception of Indigenous people?
I don't know. I think maybe if you're Indigenous, sometimes you just don't know that you're Indigenous because you're just living. And this is, I think what Fran said really just registered. We're just living our own lives. And then when you go somewhere that doesn't have Indigenous peoples in the same way, then that's when you start to sort of get a bit of a culture shock and know yourself. But I think that the issue that I have when I first moved to Kuala Lumpur in 2010 to work, firstly, a lot of people forgot that Sabah and Sarawak were part of Malaysia. So they would tell me, welcome to Malaysia. They couldn't tell the difference between Sabah and Sarawak. A lot of people had never heard of Kadazan Dusuns before over there. So there's a tendency to see that a lot of the narratives surrounding Indigenous peoples in Malaysia is exoticized. It's not told by Indigenous peoples themselves.
Right. According to government figures, and I'm speaking to the rural-urban divide at the moment, but I do want to speak a bit more about the idea of letting Indigenous people speak for themselves and tell their own stories. But one of the issues here, again, is geographical. According to government figures, nearly 50% of Taiwan's Indigenous population now live in cities, and that makes it difficult to preserve cultures, traditions, and their way of life. Now, Suming Rupi is an Indigenous musician and an actor from the Amis tribe in Taiwan. He spoke to Connected about this very issue.
所以我刚刚讲的，在家里聚会唱歌，那个事情就很难发生在都会区了。那可能几率会相对的少很多。但在部落里面，我小时候就是我家没有，我隔壁家也会有，就是我都听得到那些传统的歌谣，还有母语的环境也是会非常不太一样。就在都会区里面，会显得比较那个几率会少非常非常多。那阿米斯耶节，我觉得他有机会就是营造这样的氛围。那他也不是祭典，因为进去祭典，它毕竟还是有一个门槛在。然后在祭典要变成观光，又会有一些文化跟观光的冲突在。那我觉得音乐节反而给了另外一种新的可能，它有非常强烈的文化氛围，可是它不会有太多的像祭典的禁忌在里面。相对在认识自己。如果想要返乡的青年，在追寻自己的文化认同过程中，它可能是一个相对比较容易进去的一个方式啊。
So Suming there speaks about the importance of music and being able to preserve culture and stories. Nadira, you chose filmmaking. Can you explain what it is that you're trying to do with that, especially? And I know you don't want to particularly pigeonhole yourself in that category as just purely doing Indigenous stories, but what is it that you're trying to tell the rest of the world or the rest of Malaysia?
Firstly, I wanted to make films because I was just interested in cinema, and a lot of what I was exposed to tended to be Western films. But then gradually, as I started to learn about Southeast Asian cinema, I learned about how personal filmmaking can be and how beautiful it is to be able to finally see films where people have similar experiences and people who look like you are on screen. But then coming back to Malaysia, I found that I didn't have this experience because Malaysian cinema is essentially Peninsular Malaysian cinema. And I guess I started to dig deeper into what my source of stories would be, and it ended up being my Indigenous heritage. So right now I'm working towards being able to sort of take up space and make my film titled Wilderness, which is based on Indigenous folklore, Kadazandusun folklore, and be able to translate that into a cinematic language. So from oral traditions to cinematic language, there is a kind of politics as well that comes with being Indigenous. It's not just your ethnicity and your background. It's not just loving nature. Some people think that if you love nature, you can be Indigenous. I said, no, it doesn't work that way. But it's having to constantly counter the cultural erasure. And when you create cinema, what you're also doing is you're creating new memories. You're creating a new an experience for people. And I think that that's really powerful for Indigenous peoples to go beyond performative sharing and sharing with our voices and our live experiences.
Fran, you grew up in your village, your ancestral village. Can you tell us how important storytelling and music and dance and basically the whole idea of passing down kind of your tradition and culture orally was, and how you feel about that in the city? Are you seeing, are you worried that it will disappear because we don't see it in daily modern life?
Well, I have to say, I think I would be worried about the things, even though that we try to preserve all this history by technical devices. But I have to say, only when you are in this environment, you can have a stronger feeling. When I stay in a village, and after the dinner or when the family gathering together, we sing, we dance, or we share the story, like what our ancestors, experienced. And even although the music is very soft element, but there's a lot of power and wisdom inside. So you do feel like when somebody sing the same song or sing some like a familiar rhyme, then you feel connected. So I know it's interesting things like Indigenous people, even they immigrate to the city, they still try to live together. So I know some certain city area, there are a lot of Indigenous people that live together, and they still can have this kind of like a music or this cultural elements in their life. Yeah.
Nadira, you had a very different upbringing and in a very mainstream system. Why do you feel that it is necessary to explore this part of you? What made you realize or really pushed you to try and understand more about your Indigenous background?
I think where the interest started in my own Indigenous heritage is that I have always been an environmentalist. I've always cared about nature, and I think that when I started my career, I was also helping out with sort of environmentalist campaigns, and I think developing my network with other Indigenous NGOs as well, like Pakos Trust, gave me kind of another community, another home, another form of access to my own heritage. And it helped me to sort of like forgive myself for not necessarily having that immediate interaction. And the more I learned as well about how that had been systematically taken away from me, because there was a point where there were Malayization sort of policies where they had tried to ban Indigenous languages from the radio or reduce them. It took me a while to realize that it wasn't my fault that I was not exposed to my culture, but I was very fortunate that there were NGOs there, and that my passion for the environment led me back to my roots.
And Fran, if I could flip that question to you and ask you, how did you feel you had to change? You grew up in the ancestral village, clearly living by the traditions and being part of that culture, and then moving to the city and becoming living in the urban areas. How did you feel you had to change to adapt to that, or to be more part of the mainstream, or did you have to change?
So actually, I grew up in this multicultural environment. So I don't really feel that I have a lot of things to change, but it's just that you need to have more understanding, and you need to have more. I would say you need to have You need to have stronger muscle, because in the city there are a lot of people that don't understand your culture or why you're saying some word or sentence or even your behavior. If there's one thing that have to change to adapt in the city or urban life, it would be I have to train my mental resilience, or you could say that a strong muscle to face all the kind, even is people maybe it's a prize to you, like indigenous people can sing, but actually it's kind of like a micro discrimination topic here.
Fran, I'm changing tack a little bit here. I know you're familiar with the National Indigenous Games held in Taipei, which featured thousands of athletes competing in a range of sports, which included traditional Indigenous events. And for the first time, New Zealand Maori participated in the competition. Our reporter James Chater looks at the significance of the Games.
This is Taiwan's National Indigenous Games. The event brings together more than 8,000 athletes from Taiwan's 16 indigenous tribes in a celebration of sport and indigenous culture. But this year, the Games have a very special first-time visitor from Aotearoa, New Zealand.
I'm Māori, the Indigenous people of Aotearoa, and it's awesome to be a part of this event. It's the first time that Māori has been a part of this event, and it's an honour and a privilege to be here.
Taiwan's indigenous people make up around 2.5% of the country's population. Those communities have historical connections with indigenous peoples across Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific. Researchers have demonstrated ties between the indigenous languages of Taiwan and New Zealand. Tina Wilson is New Zealand's Director of Trade in Taiwan. She helped get the Maori athletes to Taiwan and says events like this are about much more than just sport.
We spend quite a bit of time with our counterparts trying to have study across both, because we can also learn from Taiwanese as well. It's not one way. It could span from entities, urban living, revitalisation of language and culture. How does that survive in a modern day context? Urban drift, all those things that really happen in Indigenous communities that then get disenfranchised from their original home places.
But here, those discussions are taking place through the medium of sport. One of the signature events is traditional hunting, where a team of 8 must catch and carry a pig at the Games, represented by a 70-kilogram sack. This team from Taiwan's central city of Taichung took home first prize.
传统狩猎在我们原住民16族几乎每一族都有打猎的一个文化习俗，所以这个项目呢，对我们文化传承是非常有意义的。那我们每队呢都有老中青合在一起，来共同完成这个技术的传承呢，跟狩猎团结合作。
Of course, this is a competition, and this team behind me is very happy that they've won today. But ultimately, this is an event about community and bringing together Indigenous people from across Taiwan and indeed around the world. James Chater and William Chen for Connected.
So Fran, you were part of the organizing committee and you were at the Games. If you could explain to Nadira the significance of these Games and why Taiwan is holding them.
Okay, the National Indigenous Game is a very special and also not special, because this is the athlete competition which will be held once 2 years, and this is, I would say, the indigenous of the Olympic game in Taiwan. So in this game there are two kinds. One is a traditional games, and another one is like a racing, swimming, and all this you can see in the Olympic. And we had this competition. There's a lot of multifunction. One is like to try to let people to preserve our traditional skills, and also can let all the indigenous people come to one place and we can meet, and there are a lot of social function in this game. And this year, as the second time that we recruit a team from the Pacific Island, and this is the first time that it's only we recruit one team. They are all from New Zealand.
So in a way, Nadira, you're doing that through your filmmaking. How have your films so far been received, and what is the usual response to them, especially when they are dealing with Indigenous topics?
So I had lived in rural Sabah in Ranau for a year, working with the community there to assist them in telling their own stories. And I think what was interesting about screening the films back to urban people in KL was that the more negative responses or the strange responses were kind of like, oh, I love history, because they couldn't understand that people still live like that today. Because they're so urban. People want exotic images of Indigenous peoples. If we're not exotic enough from them, if we don't live up to the stereotypes in their heads, when they see us as regular people, even though we're not entirely, they get disappointed and sort of like turned off. But with younger people younger audiences are amazing because they're much more aware of diversity and inclusion. If they see something that's different from them, they want to learn more about it. But the struggle that I had definitely making these films was that I also had to become a film programmer, because if you present the work just on its own, a lot of people might not, who are not Indigenous, might not have a context for what it is, and they might get confused if there's no call to action, because they believe that Indigenous peoples are always, I guess, in peril. In a sense, we are, but yeah, we can also be normal people, and that can be disappointing for some people sometimes.
So, Fran, I saw you nod there at several points as Nadira was speaking, and one of the ideas is, with things like the Indigenous Games, how is it being received by the wider public, and the danger of exoticism, them saying, okay, this is how Indigenous people look and act and are, rather than accepting that you are all the same, but with different cultures and backgrounds.
I think when we are really doing like a great job and this raising or mother zone or this area, then they of course they will cheer for you, but they wouldn't be too much surprised. But in these traditional games items, if you, for example, we have this you have to carry some heavy things and running. And of course, it's funny for them. Before we carried maybe the wild pig, but now, of course, in this game we cannot really bring a wild pig there. So we have to put something like heavy, a ball or something, and to carry it. And I'm not sure how the other people will think that way. Maybe also for them, it's it's not exalted or indigenous enough to to entertain or something. Yeah, I think there are some phenomenal situations, the similar situations here as well.
So back to you, Nadira. You spoke about the future generation and how or the younger generation and how they are more accepting. But what would you like to see for the future generation? What is the one wish you have when it comes to the future Indigenous generations in Malaysia?
I would like to see more acceptance for Indigenous curators and Indigenous producers as well. Why I identify as an Indigenous filmmaker, again, is not just because of my heritage, but because of the politics of having to reverse cultural erasure. And the dangers of it is sometimes when you're Indigenous, you either have to deal with people who have forced you to assimilate, or you have to deal with other philanthropists or people in the arts or scholars who romanticize Indigenous peoples so much that they want to take our stories and our opportunities from us. So the politics of being an Indigenous person in the creative industries is actually pretty tenuous. But I definitely want to see more Indigenous curators, more Indigenous gallerists, and art managers who are sensitive to Indigenous issues. I don't want to be in a position to teach allies how to treat me. I want to see more Indigenous peoples assume those managerial roles so that we can all have safe spaces and understand Indigenous stories on the terms of Indigenous peoples.
And Fran, within your generation, we've seen a change in the way Taiwan acknowledges and values and is trying to understand more about Indigenous backgrounds and culture. But what do you hope for the next generation of young Indigenous people in Taiwan?
Well, I would like to, I think there's an important thing is like in my experience that actually Indigenous culture is inspiring a lot of Taiwanese people, because we are being told that we are from some other place or we don't have our own history here. But in my experience, there's a lot of people that they have the interaction with Indigenous people, then they start to think about, so where am I from? So I would say I would tell the young generation that to be proud and to be more confident about your culture, or even to sharing. So I would say, I know some Indigenous people, because of the history reason, that we are kind of close our mind, or we are afraid to do more exchange with the non-Indigenous. So I think we also have to be more open-minded, to be more inclusion, to share our culture, and also like we have to be realize that we are all living in the same island. We are all Taiwanese people.
Nadira Ilana in Kuala Lumpur, Fran Pan in Taipei, I can't thank you both enough for speaking so candidly about your own personal journeys and shedding some insight, and perhaps we can learn a lot from your experiences in how we move forward with Indigenous communities and being more inclusive all around. Thank you very much. And to our viewers, it's been great to have your company. Thank you for your time. Stay connected.